Hello students, and this is the second recording I'm making for our class, Ethics in Education. I'm going to confess that I have just now finished recording what was almost an hour, and I was off the screen. That is to say, now I'm looking at a screen where I can see myself and I can see that it's recording, but I had gotten off of this screen because I was working with some other documents, and when I went to say adieu, bon voyage, and assuming that I'd recorded everything, I went back to this particular YouTube screen and discovered that in fact it had shut down. And what was really kind of cruel about it is that the timer had continued to go. So it showed me that I'd been going on for some time, but it didn't tell me that it had stopped. So no warning, I don't know. So I'm going to give it another shot. I will have to say, though, that it was probably a good thing that it shut down, because it went on for much too long, almost an hour. And this is not my intention. My intention is not to speak for an hour. That it was not recorded and that I lost an hour of a presentation, there will be many more, especially on Arendt. But I do think that it's best that it wasn't recorded. I'm trying to feel okay about it. As you can see, I'm talking myself through it. So let me give you some context just for where I am. And as you can see, I think I'm on the 7th floor of the University of Southern Maine library, which is in Portland, Maine, which is where I live. And this is the view. I don't know how this is appearing on screen, but that is called the Back Cove. This is Forest Avenue, and over there is the hill, which is called the eastern part of the city of Portland. We're looking north here, and this is east, and that's where downtown Portland is. And this is the group study room, but I'm here solo. No one else is here, just me presenting. And this is actually where we'll be doing the Google Plus online real-time seminar when that happens, a week from this Monday. So that's where I am right now, and I wanted to begin again, this time though without going out and showing you the portrait of Longfellow, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I want to start with a quotation from Longfellow that is included from just this past week's HannahArendtCenter.org blog, when they have a thread called Thoughts on Thinking. And this one from January the 23rd is simply one of many portraits you'll see of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I have a little portrait of Longfellow, or a copy of it, posted, and then they have a quotation from Longfellow, which is the following: "Thought takes man out of servitude into freedom." Thought takes man out of servitude into freedom. Thought takes man out of servitude into freedom. So I wanted to start with that quotation of Longfellow, and in the other video that I made, the one that is poof, I began out in the hallway here at the library, next to the portrait of Longfellow. Because Longfellow is a very important figure here in Maine, and specifically here in Portland. He's kind of like the patron saint of Portland. is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. There is this middle school named after him. There is a square in downtown Portland named after him. There is Longfellow's house that is in Portland, and there's a museum, on and on and on. So it's kind of the context in which I'm in. And perhaps in an upcoming presentation, I'll talk a little bit more about the importance of context, of being here in Maine, in Portland, and why I live here. And why I can live here, in part because of this type of media, this teaching of distance learning, but why I choose to live here. But that's for another day. The quotation itself, though, is really important. It's really relevant. Sorry about that. It's the second time around. It's relevant. Thought takes man out of servitude into freedom. It's very relevant for this course in particular, which is the third of 3 courses that I teach in Foundations of Education at Hofstra. The first being the Introduction to Philosophy of Education course, the second being the course in what I call the Philosophy of Difference, which is the Multicultural Education course, but it is really the course in Thinking Difference and Thinking Differently. And this course, which is the course called Ethics for Educators, but it is really about the moral authority, or the course should be titled The Moral Authority of the Educator, Thinking and Responsibility. So all 3 courses are focused on thinking in the Arendtian sense of thinking, and you could say the traditional philosophical sense of thinking, which is counterposed to knowledge. And I believe I talked a little bit about that in my introductory video, which I recorded this past week for you, and which I talked about and through Arendt's introduction to the first volume of The Life of the Mind, where she is talking about thinking as being the condition that prevents us from doing evil. Now, evil for Arendt, in this case, is something very particular. It is thoughtlessness, or the lack of thinking. It sounds kind of circular, but the point for Arendt is to give a philosophical understanding of what she calls the banality of evil. And that's when we find ourselves in human institutions, organizations, like schools, where our interactions with one another are based on policies that are carried out, which is always the case in human organizations. But the problem of the banality of evil is that those practices of carrying out those policies happens in an irresponsible way. That is to say, the policies themselves are not brought about through open conversation. The people that are then subjected, that's the right word, to the policies have really had nothing to do with their articulation. What's more, they probably don't even fully understand the policies and what they fully mean. And then the most pernicious implication of the banality of evil is that those who are enforcing or carrying out the policy can't really fully take responsibility for the policy. They just have a role to play in its implementation, but they really don't embody or represent fully the policy itself. So we find ourselves in that situation today in education, and I gave an example of this when I talked about an incident that happened to me this past week on the first day of a course that I'm teaching called the Introduction to Philosophy of Education. And in that situation, as I mentioned, a staff member came into the class with a list in hand, identified 3 students that needed to leave the section of the course that I was teaching and to go to another section. In the process of doing so, this staff member embodied the banality of evil because she enacted thoughtlessness. When pushed, simply, when I asked her, well, why is it the case? She invoked the cliche. She said, well, it's for fairness. We want to keep both classes of equal numbers. I let it go because I didn't want to draw the students into some sort of dramatic scene that I knew would unfold if I pushed further. I subsequently protested by email. I wrote emails to people of influence and in the institution, and I said, what was happened here is totally unacceptable because we've undermined the rights of the students. The oldest right there is of a university student, going all the way back to the beginning of the university and the founding of the university, in the University of Bologna in the 12th century, and that is the protection of the student's rights to be a student. That's how it all started, by defining the roles. These are students, these are professors. They call them doctores. The doctore was defined as someone who interpreted the law, as opposed to those who practiced the law. Students learned under those who were interpreting the law. The university was first and foremost was a law school. But it wasn't the training of lawyers, it was the study of the law. Now, I don't want to get into that whole story. I already am 12 minutes into this recording, and I'm talking about the founding of the university in Bologna in the 12th century. So, my point is that the situation that I encountered and experienced this week, I called upon this tradition of the university, which started with the founding of the right of the student to be a student, and that is the right of the student to study. And the right of the student to study protects or is enacted in, first and foremost, their right to decide where they are going to study and with whom they're going to study, i.e. where they're going to sit, what section of a course, or what course they're going to take, and what section of that course, etc., etc. Well, reason prevailed, and those who are in a position of actually implementing and designing said policies, or in this case, just carry them forward, because these policies have been around forever, recognized that what I was saying was true, right? I mean, it's indisputable that students have this choice. The fact that students also registered protest, and at least one did in writing, and she wrote a beautiful piece of protest. It wasn't a protest in the sense of accusation. It was simply a plea, in the classic case of making an argument for a structure, power structure, and saying, you know, I demand that my right as a student be recognized. And reason prevailed, and in the end of the day, all the students were granted their right to choose where they were going to study. Nevertheless, so this is a sort of happy ending to the beginning of a semester. Nevertheless, it's an example of how we live with what Arendt calls the crisis of education. So I guess in this presentation, what I want to emphasize is, and I can see that this is too far away as I look at the screen, so I'll pull it forward. There we go. The crisis in education is something that we live with. And simply what I've written up here is crisis in education, Arendt, natality, responsibility, and authority. And also I've written up ethics and ethical imperative. Now, what I'm trying to suggest here is that we live with the crisis in education. The crisis of education that Arendt was talking about is our crisis in education. So the reason to begin with this essay is because it is an essay that not only positions and situates hour discussion in our course of study. But it does so because her concern with education at the time that she wrote this piece over 50 years ago, but not much more than 50 years ago, is still and remains our crisis. Now, it remains our crisis for a very specific reason. It remains the crisis for us because of something that's a little bit more nuanced than what we might understand when we read the Crisis of Education. Because in the Crisis of Education, Arendt does not necessarily talk about the problem of evil or the banality of evil, and she doesn't talk about thoughtlessness in the way that she does in the introduction to the Life of the Mind, the first line thinking. But for me, the two are linked, and I make this point in an article that I shared with you from Teachers College Record that I wrote called The Conservation of Thinking. The Conservation of the Revolution, excuse me. I got distracted by the computer. And in that piece, I show, and I would recommend that you have a look at it, both the wider context or the more specific context for the Crisis of Education, where it's coming from, why she wrote it, what was the need she felt to write it. But I also talk about the philosophical context for her writing The Crisis in Education, specifically the link between the crisis in education and thinking itself. And the banality of evil is right there at the center. Because although she doesn't talk about it, readers of Arendt at the time, and we should also therefore make this connection, understood that the crisis in education for Arendt was a crisis of responsibility and a crisis of authority. So the relationship between authority, that is to say the moral authority of the educator, was a crisis of responsibility, of not taking responsibility. And the crisis of education, then, is really a crisis of thinking. It's a crisis of thoughtlessness, right? So the crisis itself is the pervasiveness or the ubiquity of non-thinking in education. And in a very specific way, it's the ubiquity of policies that govern our practices in education that have not been articulated by those who are practicing education, right? So we're living in a time that is an education where our practices are being governed by or dictated from somewhere else. We have very little control over in the design. We're not really participating in the articulation of these policies, of these mandates, of the way that we're supposed to be designing curricula, designing our classes, organizing our classes, etc., etc., etc. This is the time of Common Core, of high-stakes testing, of all sorts of examples that we have here are manifestations of this ubiquity of thoughtlessness in education. So the crisis in education that she describes, which is actually grown into something much more concerning to us today. So the reason we begin with Arendt, both with this introduction to Life of the Mind and now with Crisis in Education, is to give us sort of a position into how we should be even having this conversation about ethics in education. So why are we having a conversation about ethics in education that isn't simply taking up cases of the ethical problem or moral issues in education? This isn't a course in moral issues in education. It's a course that is designed to take up, in a very direct way, the crisis in education that we find ourselves in today. So that's why we begin with Arendt. So again, I ask you to go and look at this piece that I posted that is a discussion of Arendt's Crisis in Education that gives, my article that gives a wider sort of context for things and talks a lot about sort of where I'm coming from. But I wouldn't do that first. The first thing I would do is to read the essay that is from Between Past and Future. I would read the essay first, and then go and have a look at some of the pieces that I posted that I've written. I've included a nice summary recently written as a post on the aforementioned Hannah Arendt Center, and it's a post by a teacher, and so I think that it's a good one. And actually, what's interesting about that summary and overview is that it links the Arendt's crisis to the allegory of the cave, which is the piece that I believe we'll be looking at next, and then Kant. So that connection between Plato, Arendt's debt to Plato, particularly Socrates and the allegory of the cave, is talked about also by this teacher who wrote a nice overview on the crisis in education. You might take a look at that before you read Crisis in Education, but I really want to recommend that you read the Crisis in Education, and then you will have a look at some of the things that I've written, the longer piece, but also the shorter piece that I'm going to talk a little bit about now in my presentation. So the Longfellow quotation that thinking emancipates us, I'm paraphrasing us, into freedom is key, both in terms of thinking about Arendt's the genealogy of her thinking, going back to Plato, the allegory of the cave as one of the quintessential philosophical pieces that describes the process of emancipation. We will examine that and look at that next week. And then Kant. So this connection between thinking and freedom, or unthinking and oppression, which is not a word that Arendt uses, but it's something that we should certainly be thinking about, is there. So there's this connection that we need to think about. So yes, the conditions that we find ourselves in today are quite oppressive, and they're quite disturbing in regards to what it means to be an educator, what it means to be a student, what it means to be practicing education today. And so that's kind of our challenge, right? So we face an ethical imperative, if you will, to deal with this problem, which manifests itself in so many ways. So, so I would have you look at those pieces, and then I want to talk a little bit about this ethical imperative specifically in the crisis in education. When you read the piece, you will see that what Arendt is really focused on is this problem of the lack of educational authority, or that is to say that the irresponsibility of the teacher emerges for Arendt as the crisis in education. And so I wanted to highlight a couple of quotations from Arendt, and just as a way of giving some context for this, but again, I don't want to overstep my bounds and give you too much, because I want you to discover for yourself. So one of the quotations that I would call attention to is in the paragraph right before section 2, where she says, what makes the educational crisis in America so especially acute is the political temper of the country, which of itself struggles to equalize or to erase as far as possible the differences between young and old, between children and adults, particularly between pupils and teachers. So she is calling attention to something very odd or interesting, depending on how you think about it, which is to say that our desire, our passion for equality, and again, this was written over 50 years ago, but not much more than that, when questions of equality were in the air, and they were so for some time. Today, we don't hear much talk about equality. The only mention of equality is when we talk about it in terms of income inequality and the growing inequality that we are facing more and more and more. So it's interesting to take up this question of the crisis in education in a time where there is growing economic, and some would argue political inequality, in America today. And the political inequality is manifesting itself in the crisis in education that I'm referring to. But economic inequality, which is of another sort, is also quite grave. But questions or discussions of equality are not so much on the table. You don't hear people talking about equality in the way that they were talking about it in the time when Arendt wrote this piece. But her point is that our tradition of equality led in her time and leads us, she says, to erase the distinctions, the traditional distinctions between adults and children, and specifically between teachers and students. So the problem is to recover this, if you will, distinction, and to take up the responsibility that we ought to be taking up insofar as we maintain our responsibility for the child and for the world. Now, just to give some more context, towards the end of section 3 in the essay, she then describes what she's doing as conservative education. And she's clear to say that what she means by conservative education is not an ideological form of conservatism, but has more to do with conservation. And she said, to avoid misunderstanding, it seems to me that conservatism, in the sense of conservation, is the essence of the educational activity. Let me read that again. It seems to me, Arendt writes, that conservation, in the sense of conservation, is the essence of the educational activity. So, and then she goes on, it is our task to cherish and protect something, that's the conservation, the child against the world against the child, the new against the old against the new. And that really, for Arendt, is what it means to take up responsibility, that is to say, to exercise our moral authority. The educator places himself in the midst of the relationship between the child and the world, and it's important that you realize that the world for Arendt isn't the natural world, but the world is the collection of what we might call the artifacts of human civilization. A good example is this very room that I'm in. This room in this library, it's interesting because this library, this building was once a biscuit factory, so who knows if they were making biscuits in this part of this 7th floor, what kind of biscuits they were making, or what was the stage of the process of making biscuits. That all being said, the building is now a library. It's the library of the University of Southern Maine in Portland. And this room that I'm in is the group study room. And in this room, we have then created a world. It's a world of study or a world of learning. It's part of the world of learning. It's part of the world. It's a continuity, in fact. So better put, this room represents part of the world, specifically that part of the world that is devoted to education, and this part of the world of education is a space that is devoted to study, right? So it's a group learning room. So for Arendt, being conservative in our approach to education would mean that we use this room responsibly. I think I'm using it responsibly. Insofar as I'm doing this work with you, although I'm recording it and you'll see it later. I've used a dry erase marker, so when I'm done, I'll be able to erase what I've written here. If I used a permanent marker, that would be an irresponsible use of this space, and it would be a non-conservative, in the sense of conservation, use of relationship to the world. So for Arendt, you have then this interesting relationship between humans and the worlds that we create that are expressions and manifestations of our humanity. And one of the most important, if not the most important, characteristic of humanity is what Arendt calls natality. I don't know if you can make that out, but that word is natality. And natality is something that she talks a lot about in The Crisis in Education. It's one of her most important concepts. And natality is simply the characteristic of the human being that makes us what she calls well, unique to the world, but it's the characteristic of our capacity to bring something new into the world. So we are all born into this world. We are all unique insofar as we are who we are, and no one else can be us, and we can't be anyone else about who we are. And that process of becoming who we are is part of what we call life, human life, and that has a narrative to it and has all these qualities that are beyond just physical being that we are. And part of what education is about is protecting and cultivating that sense of who we are, that is to say, our natality. But in order for us to, particularly when we're young, to grow into this sense of our power of making and contributing something to the world, and therefore sort of realizing our natality, part of what goes into that, and that's really what education is about, is conserving that, that's a sense of conservation, is that we need to protect this child, protect the student, from the power of this world. And the power of this world that Arendt is referring to is the fact that it's old, and it's complicated, and it has so much that it would burden and overwhelm the student, and it overwhelms us when we think of it in all of its history and all its complexity and all of its problems. So part of conservation involves giving us, the student, the time and the space to really develop into who they are, but in less psychological and personal terms, it's the capacity, it's the time and space to think, which is to say to develop the capacity and to enact the possibility of freedom. That is to say, the freedom to bring something new into this world. On the other hand, we have to protect the world itself from the newcomer. And again, the example of my arrival into this room and my use of this room. Conserving the world and protecting the world is ensuring that I don't use a permanent marker, I shouldn't use a permanent marker, or doing anything that's going to render this room unusable by the next person or group of people that come in to use this room. It's a small example, but I think it's illustrative of what Arendt is talking about, and it really connects to sustainability. That is to say, we should be careful to ensure that we are conserving the world from the newcomer, so that what we do in the end is we are adding to it. We're also doing the work of restoration. I talk a lot about our time in this world as being both adding something new, but also maintaining and restoring what's there. So for Arendt, our relationship to the world and the reason it needs to be protected from the new is one of certain reverence towards the past. And she talks about that a lot in her essay on authority. That is to say, so for Arendt, you have these two sort of interesting powers at work, which is authority, the power of authority, which is manifested in a kind of reverence to the past, or respectful reverence to the past, which is not to say that the past is unquestionable or unquestioned, and we just reproduce the past. In fact, what protects us from that sort of thing is our freedom, right? And the freedom is a gesture towards the future, which is always unknown and always unpredictable. And so freedom on the one hand, which is a gesture towards the past, future, and authority, which is in a way a reverence towards the past, sort of collide together in the now. And it's these two forces that we sort of keep in balance. And what's interesting is that this relationship between freedom and authority Arendt manifests itself right in the form of the educator, right? So we stand between the new in the form of the student and the old, the world that they're going into, and we kind of represent the now. And it's in this sense in which I want to talk about the crisis in education in terms of time. So the last point I want to talk about, and this I address in both the longer paper that I shared with you as well as the shorter paper, which is called In the Time of Thinking Differently. And in the couple of moments that I have left that I'm going to take, I just wanted to underline that one way of thinking about the crisis in education is from the point of view of time. So when we think of crisis in a very everyday sort of commonsensical way, we think of having a crisis or undergoing a crisis, and crisis has this sense of a negative connotation. But there's another philosophical understanding of crisis,
And that connotation of crisis is as a time of opportunity. So crisis then becomes a way of understanding a particular moment in time when opportunity arises. And it's in this sense that I want to emphasize Arendt's crisis in education as what she calls at the very end of her essay, the point at which we make a decision. And so at the very end of the essay, she says, education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, and by the same token save it from ruin. It's also the point when we decide whether we love our children enough not to expel them from our world and leave them to their own devices, nor to strike from their hands their chance of undertaking something new, something unforeseen by us. So it's crisis then is a point. It's a point in time. And I want to argue it's the point of time, in time, or the time of learning, actually, of teaching and learning. So the time of the teacher, or the time of teaching, is the crisis in education, understood as the opportunity to conserve natality and to conserve the world, to conserve what is meant to be protected, if you will, on both ends, what is new and what is old. So I want to argue then that when we think of the moral authority of the educator, we have to think of it in terms of a kind of temporality as happening within a particular temporality, so that it's not something that is a moral authority that is ever outside of the specific event or experience of education itself. It kind of arises in that moment. It's not something that is written down on a paper and given to the teacher, or nor is it codified as something that we can turn to and say, well, here's my moral authority. It's enshrined or codified in some kind of ethical Bill of Rights. On the contrary, it is something that is quite real and quite embodied, and it happens each time we find ourselves in the role of education, or the educator, the role of the educator in the event of education. And so that the moral authority arises with a decision, right? It arises with the decision when we decide to conserve and protect the student's natality, or what Arendt would call plurality, insofar as all singular beings, or all people taken together. And when we decide that we want to conserve the world, or protect the world, that is to say, to ensure that there is a world in which we are able to contribute something to, there's something still around that we can participate in making, as well as restoring. So the moral authority, the power, if you will, of the educator, or the power of education, emerges from this decision to take on this role, to take on this practice of conservation. That is to say, to be the conservative educator. I want to have us explore this, what this actually means, right? What does it mean to take up this position? What does it mean to inhabit this time of opportunity? What does it mean to make a decision from within the crisis in education as the time of opportunity? I like to also talk about this time of opportunity as a time of thinking, because for Arendt, thinking and freedom are linked so closely. So it's a philosophical event, if you will, then, where this power emerges. I also like to think, and I've been doing work recently on the relationship between thinking, freedom, and spontaneity, right? And so there's all these elements of time that are at work here, but there is no time like the present, to use an old phrase. And what we're talking about here always emerges in a very real way with the challenge of responding to our students and the educational situation. So again, going back to this example of what happened at Hofstra this week, there was a sense in which there was an immediate situation that was calling forth a response. I'd like to think that I responded in a way that Arendt would consider to be thoughtful, and at the moment I feel as if perhaps I did. Now, that's just to take us back to a point I was about to make to conclude, which is to say that the course, with having said all of this and having read Arendt, it isn't to say that we've settled the matter or even settled the vocabulary. All I've tried to do with initiating the course with the crisis of education is to sort of set the terms for our conversation, so to speak. It's also to invite us to explore further exactly how one makes this decision or how one takes this decision to take up the moral authority, to enact one's moral authority. This is the question still to be explored, right? Part of what we'll need to do is to look at some sort of classic works of philosophy, traditional works of philosophy, with reverence. They're worth preserving, but also questioning them, just to get an idea of what we mean by the time of thinking and thinking itself and its relationship to freedom. Then we'll ask along the way, well, how is it that we would bring about this experience of freedom or this experience of things? There's a very practical element that we will come back to this question again and again and again, because in different ways we will be exploring different possibilities of how we respond to this crisis in education. So the matter is not settled at all. In fact, we're just beginning. And in fact, this is a course, insofar as it is a course at the university, it's a graduate course, we are theorizing on the possibilities, yes, of how we might deal with the crisis that is far from ending. Now, the crisis now in the cultural and political, historical way of thinking about it, this larger crisis, this crisis of thoughtlessness, this is very much alive and well, and absolutely the challenge that we have before us in our professional lives as educators is to deal with this crisis in education, and then to deal with it in a way by taking up the crisis in education, which is the time opportunity. I think and hope that this has been recorded so that I can share it with you, and you'll use it, view it as some context for your reading of this essay, this important essay by Hannah Arendt. As I suggested to you, please read the piece first, then perhaps have a look at some of the articles that I've written in response, and then the process is, of course, that you'll be writing comments online in the online open discussion through the end of the week, and then in a week from Monday, we will be gathering together for our first online real-time seminar, which I will be conducting from this very spot. Okay. Thank you for your attention.